Scientists just ground a 2,000-year-old human skull into powder, not to destroy it, to solve one of the most stubborn and unsettling mysteries in the entire history of archaeology. And what they found inside that powder has left the scientific community in a place nobody expected, not with answers, with more questions than they started with. Because the brand new DNA study published just weeks ago, in May of 2026, by researchers at Liberty University in Virginia, did not confirm that these skulls are alien. But it also could not confirm that they are fully understood. The results came back inconclusive. And in science, inconclusive is sometimes the most disturbing word of all, because it means the mystery is still open. It means we still do not know the full truth about who these people were, where they really came from, and why their skulls look the way they do. And today we are going to walk through everything: the real anatomy, the real DNA history, the most recent findings, and the genuine scientific debate that has been running for decades and just got louder. Stay until the very end, because the final piece of this story is the one that nobody in the mainstream media is talking about clearly. Subscribe right now if you want more videos like this one: real history, real science, zero fluff. And drop the comment telling me where you're watching from. I get messages from every corner of the world, and I love hearing from you. Now let us go back to where this story started. The year is 1927. A Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello is working on the Paracas Peninsula, a wind-swept, sun-scorched stretch of coastline on the south coast of Peru. The desert there is brutal, dry and hot, and seemingly empty. Tello and his team were not expecting anything remarkable. They were doing careful, methodical work in ground that looked like it had nothing left to offer. And then the earth opened up. Beneath the surface, they found a massive underground burial complex. Deep, precisely carved, stone-lined chambers that archaeologists call cholpas. And inside those chambers, arranged with careful, deliberate intention, were over 300 skulls. But these were not normal human skulls. They were stretched, elongated, extended backward and upward in a way that defied what most researchers thought was physically possible. The shape was so extreme and so consistent across so many individuals that from the very first moment, the scientific world could not agree on what it meant. The skulls were not the only remarkable thing in those tombs. The bodies had been wrapped in textiles so fine and so intricately woven that modern textile experts still regard the Paracas burial cloths as among the most technically sophisticated fabrics ever produced in the ancient world. The individuals buried there were surrounded by ceremonial objects, carved blades, jewelry, items that spoke of high status and enormous cultural importance. These were not ordinary people. Whatever the Paracas civilization was, these were its elite, and they had been buried with the kind of care and ceremony that a civilization reserves for its most powerful and most revered. When radiocarbon dating was applied to the remains, the results pushed the story back dramatically. The burials dated to between roughly 3,000 and 2,800 years ago, placing the Paracas culture firmly in the window between 800 and 1,000 years before the Common Era. That timeline is crucial. It means the Paracas civilization was already flourishing in Peru long before the Inca Empire was even a distant idea, and centuries before the Nazca people carved their famous geoglyphs into the desert of the same region. The Paracas were one of the earliest and most sophisticated cultures in all of the Andes, and their skulls have been confusing scientists for nearly 100 years. So what actually causes that shape? Because this is where the real science starts, and it is more interesting than most coverage of the Paracas skulls ever admits. The accepted explanation among mainstream archaeologists and bioarchaeologists is intentional cranial modification. This is a documented cultural practice that has been found on every inhabited continent on Earth. The Maya did it in Central America. Cultures in Central Africa did it. The Huns of Eurasia did it. Ancient peoples in Vanuatu in the Pacific did it. And the Paracas did it on a scale that was extraordinary even by global standards. The practice works like this. A newborn baby's skull is soft and pliable. The bones have not yet fully fused. Starting very shortly after birth, families would bind the infant's head tightly using cloth wraps, cords, wooden boards, or some combination of these materials. The steady, gentle pressure applied over months and years would gradually reshape the growing skull, guiding the bone to develop in the elongated direction rather than the normal rounded one. The process was not painful or harmful when done correctly. The brain has room to grow. The skull just grows into a different shape. And crucially, when you look at the individual from the front, the face looks completely normal. Only the back and top of the skull are dramatically different. The scientific evidence for this explanation at Paracas is overwhelming. A major peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2022 analyzing 159 individuals excavated from the Paracas Cavernas site at Cerro, Colorado, found that 98% of those individuals showed clear evidence of intentional cranial modification. 98%. That is not a coincidence or a random biological quirk. That is a cultural practice applied to nearly every single member of this community, consistently and deliberately. The most common skull shape found was classified as tabular erect, present in 60% of the sample, achieved by binding wooden boards against the forehead and the back of the skull to elongate the cranium vertically. A second type, called bilobate, was significantly more common in females than males, which tells researchers that skull shape in this community was connected to gender identity within Andean cosmological belief. This was a society that encoded its understanding of the universe, of gender, of status, and of spiritual authority directly into the physical shape of people's heads from the moment they were born. The question is why? Why would an entire civilization do this to its children? What belief system was powerful enough to make parents bind their newborn skull as one of the first acts of raising that child? The anthropological consensus is that in the Paracas world, the elongated head was a mark of elite status, spiritual authority, and connection to something greater than ordinary human life. The head was the seat of the mind and the soul. Changing its shape was a way of visually marking certain individuals as closer to the sacred, as possessing wisdom and power that ordinary people did not. In the Andean cosmological worldview, this kind of physical distinction was not seen as artificial or performed. It was seen as revealing and expressing a real spiritual truth about who that person was. And because virtually the entire Paracas community participated in this practice, at least among those who were buried at Cerro Colorado, it also functioned as a group identity marker, a visible signal of belonging to this particular culture at this particular moment in history. Now here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because while the intentional modification explanation handles the shape, it does not explain everything that researchers have noticed about these skulls, and the details that remain unexplained are the ones that have been driving scientific debate for decades, and now, in 2026, are driving it harder than ever. Some researchers examining the Paracas skulls have noted that certain specimens display unusual internal bone structure. Specifically, some skulls appear to lack the sagittal suture, the joint that normally runs along the top of the skull, joining the two major bone plates together. The sagittal suture is present in normal human skulls. Its absence is rare, though not unheard of in individual cases. But critics of the simple modification explanation point to the frequency of its absence in the Paracas sample as something that needs more investigation. Others have noted that some skulls appear to have a cranial volume larger than what standard head binding should be able to produce, since modification can change the shape of the skull, but cannot simply create additional bone mass or significantly increase brain volume. These claims remain contested. Mainstream bioarchaeologists argue that the measurements being cited are within the range of normal human variation when the unusual shape is properly accounted for, but the debate has not been settled to everyone's satisfaction. And this debate, this gap between the mainstream explanation and the persistent anomalies that some researchers keep pointing to, is exactly what has driven the DNA testing efforts. Because if the skulls are purely the product of a human cultural practice applied to biologically normal human beings, the DNA should clearly show ancestry consistent with the indigenous populations of South America. That is what scientists expected when they started testing, and what they found was more complicated. The most widely cited DNA results came from preliminary analyses published between 2014 and 2016 by a researcher named Brian Forster and his associates. These initial results reported something startling. The mitochondrial DNA from some Paracas skulls showed haplogroups, which are specific inherited genetic markers passed through the maternal line that were associated not with indigenous South American populations, but with populations from the other side of the world. Haplogroups like H2A, which is common in Eastern Europe, haplogroup T2B, associated with populations in Mesopotamia and the Syria region, haplogroup U2E, found in Europe, and haplogroup H1A, associated with populations around the Black and Caspian Seas. These are Old World genetic markers. They have no business turning up in 3,000-year-old skulls from coastal Peru more than 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. If accurate, these results would force a complete revision of everything historians believe about pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas. But here's where scientific integrity requires stepping back and looking at these results clearly and honestly. The mainstream archaeological community responded to the Forster results with serious skepticism, and that skepticism is scientifically justified. The 2014 and 2016 analyses were not published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. They did not include detailed methodology about how the DNA was extracted, how contamination was controlled for, or how the results were verified independently. Ancient DNA work is extraordinarily difficult precisely because contamination is a constant threat. Every person who has ever touched a specimen, every researcher who has handled the bones, every breath in the vicinity of an open sample, all of it can deposit modern human DNA onto an ancient specimen. If contamination occurs, the resulting genetic profile can look completely different from the actual ancient individual's ancestry. Without rigorous contamination controls and independent verification, the results of any ancient DNA study cannot be taken as reliable. A forensic analysis published in 2022 in the Journal of Biotechnology and Bioinformatics Research specifically examined the Paracas skulls using more rigorous forensic techniques and found that the hair structure was human and that DNA profiles obtained were consistent with modern human populations. It found no evidence of non-human or alien DNA. The alien hypothesis, which circulated widely online and on television programs for years, was not supported by serious scientific evidence. And a 2022 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, which examined the cranial modification patterns systematically across a large sample, confirmed that the elongation is the result of intentional binding, a human cultural practice applied to human biological skulls. But even setting aside the alien claims, the haplogroup findings that pointed to European and Middle Eastern ancestry have never been definitively resolved. They were preliminary. They were not peer-reviewed. But they were also never fully debunked by an independent, large-scale, methodologically rigorous study. The question of ancient contact, the question of whether some individuals buried at Paracas carried genetic lineages connected to populations far outside the Americas, that question is still technically open because the science that could settle it has not yet been done. And the reason it has not been done is the subject of its own controversy, one we will come back to. First, we need to talk about the most recent development, because this is what happened just weeks ago and what sparked this entire new wave of attention. In May of 2026, researchers from Liberty University in Virginia published findings from a new DNA extraction study specifically targeting the Paracas skulls. The team went further than any previous effort in one specific way. Instead of trying to extract DNA from bones, they focused on teeth. Teeth are widely regarded in ancient DNA research as the best possible source of preserved genetic material. The enamel and the dense inner dentine of a tooth act like a natural vault, protecting biological material from the moisture, oxygen, and microbial activity that degrade DNA in bones over thousands of years. If you are going to find recoverable ancient DNA anywhere in a skeleton, the teeth are your best chance. The Liberty University team used two different extraction methods to maximize their chances. The first was a minimally invasive approach that removed small amounts of powdered material from inside the root of the tooth. The second was far more aggressive. They ground entire teeth into powder to access every possible fragment of preserved DNA from inside. Both methods were applied to multiple specimens from the Paracas collection. And the result of all this effort, this methodologically careful, teeth-grinding, sample-destroying work, was this. The DNA they recovered was too degraded and too scarce to yield a complete genetic profile. Laboratories generally require at least 20 nanograms per microliter of DNA to produce reliable ancestry results. Even with the aggressive grinding method, the highest concentrations recovered from the Paracas teeth fell below that threshold. The samples were simply too deteriorated after thousands of years, even in the dry desert climate that had otherwise preserved the mummies remarkably well. Researcher Abigail McDowell, who was part of the Liberty University team, stated clearly that the results do not confirm or refute any theory about the origins of the mummies. The study does not say they're alien. It does not say they are not. It does not say they had European ancestry. It does not say they did not. It simply says that the DNA available in these particular samples is not sufficient for definitive conclusions right now with current techniques. The team is planning to continue the work using a process called demineralization, which breaks down the minerals inside tooth and bone material to release additional trapped DNA fragments. They hope this next step will yield better preserved genetic material and eventually provide clearer answers. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a scientifically fascinating situation that the tabloid headlines almost never accurately describe. The Paracas skulls are unambiguously human. The intentional cranial modification explanation is strongly supported by a large body of rigorous peer-reviewed research. 98% of individuals studied at one major Paracas site showed clear evidence of binding. The alien hypothesis has no credible scientific support. The specific anatomical anomalies that some researchers have pointed to, the missing sutures, the unusual bone densities, remain contested and have not been confirmed in systematic peer-reviewed studies. The earlier DNA results pointing to European and Middle Eastern haplogroups were preliminary, non-peer-reviewed, and scientifically unverified. The most recent attempt to resolve the DNA question, using the best available method, came back inconclusive because there is not enough surviving genetic material in the samples tested so far. What is genuinely and scientifically interesting is not the alien story. It is the real story. The Paracas civilization was one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient Americas. They produced textiles of extraordinary technical complexity. They built elaborate underground burial systems. They applied intentional cranial modification so consistently and so skillfully across their entire elite population that 98% of individuals in one cemetery alone showed evidence of it. They did this in ways that encoded gender, status, and cosmological identity directly into the human body. They did this to mark certain individuals as connected to the sacred and the divine. And then, sometime around 100 years before the Common Era, this culture transformed into and merged with the Nazca culture, which went on to create the famous Nazca lines, the giant geoglyphs visible from the air in the same Peruvian desert. The Paracas and the Nazca were part of a cultural continuum, and understanding the Paracas more deeply is understanding the roots of one of the most mysterious artistic traditions in all of human history. The question of their genetic connections to the rest of the ancient world remains genuinely open. If future, better preserved samples or new extraction techniques allow a complete mitochondrial DNA profile to be built from Paracas individuals, and if those profiles show haplogroups associated with European or Middle Eastern populations, that would be an extraordinary discovery. Not because it would be supernatural, but because it would mean that transoceanic contact between the Old World and the Americas happened thousands of years earlier than the established historical record acknowledges. Ancient contacts of this kind are not impossible. The DNA evidence for Polynesian contact with South America has been confirmed by rigorous peer-reviewed genetic studies published in Nature in 2020. Ancient peoples were capable of open ocean navigation. The question is not whether contact was theoretically possible. The question is whether the evidence from the Paracas skulls, once we have enough of it to analyze reliably, will show that it actually happened in this case. We do not have that answer yet, and the scientific community's inability to produce it is itself a significant part of this story. Multiple attempts to access the most critical Paracas skull specimens for independent DNA testing have reportedly been met with restrictions from the Peruvian institutions and museums that house the most important samples. Whether this is cautious institutional management of irreplaceable artifacts or something more like deliberate obstruction is a question that archaeologists and researchers have been openly debating for years. What is clear is that access to these specimens for rigorous, independently funded, peer-reviewed DNA analysis has been limited in ways that have frustrated the scientific community. And until that access is granted and the work is done at the highest possible standard of modern ancient DNA research, the mystery will remain exactly where it is today, technically unresolved. This is what makes the Paracas skulls genuinely extraordinary and genuinely worth your attention. Not because they are alien. They are not. Not because they defy human biology. They do not. But because they sit at the intersection of a confirmed, remarkable human cultural practice, a century-long scientific debate that rigorous science has not yet fully resolved, and a question about ancient human connectivity and migration that, if answered definitively, could change the story of how the ancient world was connected. The people buried in those underground chambers in the Paracas desert were real human beings. They were members of a sophisticated, organized, spiritually complex society. They shaped the heads of their children as an act of cultural identity and sacred meaning. And somewhere in the deteriorated fragments of their teeth and bones, there may still be enough genetic information to tell us something about who their distant ancestors were and how far across the ancient world human connection really reached. The scientists who just ground those teeth into powder are not giving up. They are planning the next attempt. And when those results come in, we will be here to tell you exactly what they mean. If this kind of honest, evidence-based deep dive into real mysteries is what you come here for, share this video right now with someone who thinks the truth is always more interesting than the fiction. Leave a comment below telling me what you think the next DNA results are going to show. Do you think the Paracas people had connections to the old world? Do you think the mystery will ever be fully solved? Tell me where you stand, and I will see you in the next one.